Have you ever had an experience that you just couldn't explain? Not necessarily something dramatic. Maybe it was a moment where you were completely overwhelmed by a feeling of peace. Maybe you were going through, I don't know, a really difficult time, a really difficult period in your life, and something happened. Something that completely changed your perspective. Maybe you felt the presence of someone who wasn't there anymore. Maybe you had an incredibly vivid dream about someone who has passed away. Or maybe you were somewhere in nature, walking out and looking out at the landscape. And for a few seconds, you had this strange feeling that you weren't separate from everything around you. And afterwards, your thought goes, what the hell did just happen? Because those experiences sometimes can be very difficult to put into words, and what actually is really interesting is that they happen to people who are deeply religious sometimes, but they also can happen to people who are completely not religious. They happen to people who believe in spirituality, but they also happen to skeptics. They can happen to people who weren't looking for anything, and sometimes this experience completely changed the way someone lives their life. So today I want to talk about something called spiritually transformative experiences, and I want to approach this slightly differently. I'm not here to tell you this experience prove that God exists. I'm not here to tell you that they're all supernatural. Um, I'm not here to tell you that they are all just something happening inside the brain. Actually, I think the really interesting question is somewhere in the middle, because regardless of what causes this experience, they can change people. And I think that's worth talking about. One of the things that I find so fascinating about those stories is how often people say something along the lines, I never experienced anything like this before. And that's important because we are talking about experiences that seem to break through someone's normal understanding of reality. Think about your normal day. You wake up, you check your phone, you have breakfast, you go to work, you think about money, you think about relationship, you worry about something that happened yesterday perhaps, you worry about something that is going to happen tomorrow maybe, and most of the time we are completely absorbed in our own little world. We are thinking about ourselves. What do I need to do? What does that person think of me? Am I successful enough? I'm attractive enough? What I'm going to do next? What's going to happen to me? And then occasionally something happens that completely interrupts that. And suddenly you aren't thinking about yourself anymore. You're just there. People sometimes describe this on an incredibly powerful feeling of connection. Connection with nature, connection with other person, connection with the universe, connection with God, or simply a feeling that everything is somehow part of a whole. Now, you might hear that and think, okay, that's a little bit too spiritual for me. And that's completely fair. But here is where it gets interesting. You don't actually have to believe in anything supernatural to understand why this could be incredibly powerful. Because imagine spending your entire life seeing yourself as the isolated individual, and then for one moment that feeling disappears. You don't feel separate. You don't feel like you're fighting against the world. You just feel like you're part of it. For some people, that one experience can completely change their priorities. And this is where I think the word transformative becomes really important, because having an unusual experience is one thing, being transformed by it is something else. Imagine someone who spent their entire life obsessing over their career. They're constantly working, they're constantly trying to achieve something, they're worried about money, they're worried about status, they're worried about what other people think, and then something happens. Maybe they have a serious accident. Maybe they lose someone close to them. Maybe they have a near-death experience. Maybe they're just sitting somewhere one evening and suddenly they had this overwhelming realization that life is incredibly fragile. And afterwards, their priority change. They stop caring so much about impressing people. They spend more time with the family, they become more compassionate, they start to appreciate ordinary things. They stop, put everything off until someday. And I think we all heard some version of this, you know. Someone goes through something incredibly difficult, and afterwards they say, "It did change me." And sometimes I wonder whether that's one of the most powerful things that can happen to us human beings. Not necessarily discovering some ultimate truth, but considering and discovering the way we've been living is actually the way we want to live. Now, personally, the stories that really fascinate me um, are not necessarily the really dramatic ones. They are more I would say, the ordinary ones. Someone is sitting in the car and they're having an incredibly difficult day, perhaps, and for some reason they suddenly feel like completely calm. They might describe this feeling like everything is going to be okay. They can't explain why. Nothing external has changed. They probably are still there struggling, but somehow they change. Or maybe someone who's grieving. They're missing someone terribly. And they even have, like, I don't know, dream about it. And in that dream, the person they lost appear. And maybe they have a conversation. Maybe they just simply see them. Maybe the person says something incredibly simple. And when they wake up, they feel this enormous sense of peace. Now, does that mean that the deceased person has actually visited them? I don't know. And neither do you. And that's okay. Because there is something really interesting about leaving that question open. You can say, I don't know what happened, and still recognize, but it meant something to me. I actually think that's a really healthy way to approach those kind of experiences. We don't have to immediately turn them into proof of anything. We also don't necessarily have to dismiss them. Then there are the stories that really challenge our assumptions, because sometimes the person having the experience is the person you wouldn't expect. Imagine someone who's completely skeptical about spirituality and about the spiritual realm in general. They don't meditate, they don't believe in science, they don't believe in afterlife, they don't consider themselves religious, and then they have an experience they can't easily explain. Maybe they just went for a walk and they're standing in nature, like in the middle of the field or whatever. Or maybe they're just listening to music, or maybe they are, I don't know, with someone they love, and all of a sudden they experience this overwhelming sense of awe. They feel connected to everything. They lose their normal sense of time, and for few moments, they experience something that feels almost sacred. Then afterwards, they're sitting there thinking, okay, I don't know what to do with that. And honestly, I love those stories because they remind us that you don't necessarily have to believe in spirituality or in something bigger than what you can actually see. Sometimes the experience comes first, and then the whole questioning process begins. Of course, we can't talk about spiritually transformative experiences without talking about near-death experiences. There are some of the most famous examples. People who have come extremely extremely close to death have reported things like incredibly vivid experiences, a sense of peace, encounters with loved ones, unusual perceptions of their surrounding, or just a feeling of leaving the physical body. And this is where things get really complicated, because there are neurological and physiological explanations that researchers have explored. And we shouldn't take someone's experience and automatically say, this proves there is an afterlife. That's a much bigger claim. But here's what I found fascinating. Even when you put the question of what physically caused the experience to one side, many people said the experience completely changed how they viewed life. They become less afraid of death, they become more focused on relationship, they become more actually they become less materialistic, I would say. They start asking bigger questions, and some of them essentially come away with one message. I realized I was spending my life worrying about things that didn't really matter. And I think that's something most of us can relate to, even if we never had a near death experience. Because how often do we spend an entire day worrying about something that 5 years from now it won't matter at all? Then I think there is another part that I think it gets a bit overlooked, and that's suffering. We tend to imagine spiritually transformative as something beautiful, a sunrise, a meditation, a mystical experience, a moment of incredible peace. But sometimes transformation begins with something awful. You lose someone, you get your heart broken, you lose your job, you become seriously ill. You realize that the life you built isn't actually making you happy. And suddenly, the identity you constructed from yourself is start falling apart. And that can be terrifying. But sometimes when people come through the other side, they say, I wouldn't wish it to anyone, but it changed. And I think there is an important distinction there. We shouldn't romanticize suffering. Pain isn't automatically good. Trauma isn't automatically some kind of spiritual gift. Sometimes horrible things happen simply because horrible things happen. But human beings have this remarkable ability on take an experience and create meaning from it. And maybe transformation doesn't mean everything happened for a reason. Maybe sometimes means this happened, I didn't choose it, but I can choose what I do next. And I think there is something incredibly powerful about that. Now, here is probably the question I struggle with the most. When someone has a profound spiritual experience, do we actually need to know what caused it? Because imagine you have an experience that really and completely changes you, and someone comes along and said, well, that's just your brain. Okay, maybe. But what does just your brain actually mean? Your brain is where you experience love, is where you experience music, is where you experience memories, is where you experience the birth of your child, is where you experience grief, is where you experience awe. So saying something is happening in the brain doesn't necessarily make it meaningless. And at the same time, saying something feels spiritual doesn't automatically mean we know it's a supernatural cause. And I think we can hold both of those ideas at the same time. We can remain curious and we can say, I don't know. And sometimes, I don't know is a much more interesting answer than pretending we do know. Now, this is the part I really like to ask you about. Maybe you had one of those experiences. Maybe you never told anyone about it because you were worried that they think you were weird, or maybe you don't even know how to describe it. Maybe it did happen when someone you loved died. Maybe it did happen when you were completely alone. Maybe it did happen in nature, or maybe it happened during a meditation, or just an ordinary day. And yet, something changed. Maybe your perception of yourself changed. Maybe your relationship with other people changed. Maybe you stop being afraid of something, or maybe you become much more grateful. You suddenly realize how short life is. Or, the most powerful thing, which I love, you realize that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. And then it was gone. But you remember, we spend so much time in our lives trying to understand the world. What's real? What happened after that? If there is a God, or I don't know, why are we here? What's the meaning of life? All those big questions. These are actually very enormous questions. But maybe sometimes we're asking the wrong question. Maybe instead of asking what exactly was that experience, we should also ask, what did change in me? Because let's be honest, if an experience can make you more compassionate, if it can make you appreciate the people you love the most, if it makes you feel less afraid, or if it makes you feel like more present, or if just make you realize that you don't want to waste your life, maybe its significance isn't entirely dependent on whether we can explain it. Maybe the meaning is partly in what happens afterwards. So, if you ever had a spiritual transformation experience, don't feel like you have to immediately explain. You don't have to decide whether it was God, or you don't have to decide whether it was just your brain. You don't have to decide whether it's coincidence or not. You can simply say, something happened to me and it changed me. And I still don't completely understand it. And that's okay. We're living in a world where we are constantly pushed to explain everything, to categorize everything, to put everything in a box. But there are still experiences that leave us sitting there and thinking, I genuinely don't know what happened. And maybe those moments are worth paying attention to, not because they're necessarily giving us an answer, but just because sometimes they make us questions, better questions. So I'm curious, have you ever had an experience that changed the way you see life? It doesn't have to be something supernatural. It doesn't even have to be something you consider spiritual. Maybe it was a person you met, a loss, a dream, a moment in your life, a near death experience, or maybe just a coincidence that felt almost impossible, or simply a moment where everything suddenly made sense. If you had something like that, tell me about it in the comment. Because I think some of the most interesting stories aren't the one we hear all the time. They are the one people are still trying to understand. And maybe we are one of these people. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.